I still vividly remember the day I almost got abducted. I was 12 years old, living in an isolated seaside city surrounded by boreal forest. The nearest big town was a 2-hour car ride away, and like many remote places, the area I grew up in was deeply troubled. The town was a rough mix of mining communities and an Indian reservation. Violence, theft, and drug and alcohol abuse were widespread, a constant undercurrent in the lives of its residents. Up until 4th grade, I went to a small school just 2 short streets, or about 200 meters, from my home. But that school didn't have a 5th grade, so I had to switch schools, and for the first time, ride the bus. Every morning, I'd leave the house at 6 a.m., walking a few streets to reach a long road with several intersections. The bus route was a bit peculiar. It would stop to pick up 3 students at one stop, drive ahead about 100 meters to an intersection to pick up others, then loop back to pick us up. My stopmates and I often thought it was silly to have 2 stops so close together on the same street. When we felt like sitting down early, we'd walk the extra distance to catch the bus at the pre-intersection stop. One morning, I decided to head out early. A heavy snowstorm was raging, and I knew the wind would slow me down on the way to the stop. The biting cold made the short walk feel much longer. As I approached, I noticed no one was waiting at the other stop. I figured some students might have stayed home because of the weather, while others were probably glued to their TVs, waiting to hear if it would be a snow day. By the time I reached the pre-intersection stop, the wind had numbed my face, and I could feel small patches of hardened, cold skin on my cheeks, early signs of frostbite. That was common in our climate, but I knew from experience how badly it would hurt once the skin thawed. I hoped the bus would come quickly. For a few minutes it was just me, the howling wind, and the sting of snowflakes pelting my face. Then I saw it. An old gray car slowly turning the corner, creeping along the snowy road toward me. My heart started to race as the car approached. The driver, a dirty-looking man with weathered features, was staring straight at me from behind the wheel. He passed me, pulled over into the bike lane, and stopped. I stood frozen on the opposite side of the street, watching him and trying to make sense of what he was doing. Why was this man out so early, parked in the bike lane during a snowstorm? I squinted, straining to see inside the car through the thick, swirling snow. That's when I noticed it. He was holding something in his left hand, positioned vertically, pointing directly at me. It was a camera. Panic surged through me as my body froze in fear. My mind raced, struggling to understand why he was taking pictures of me. But what unsettled me most wasn't just the camera. It was how he held it, with one hand, sideways, in a way that seemed almost unnatural. I began to breathe heavily as the reality of the situation hit me. I was too far from home to run back, and most people in the area were likely still asleep, their doors locked against the cold. I was stuck. If this man decided to attack me, there was nowhere to go, no one to help me. I felt completely exposed, standing there in the middle of the snowstorm. Run, I told myself, but no matter how much I willed it, my body refused to move. The car started to roll forward again, this time crossing over to my side of the road. He was coming toward me, slowly, methodically. The closer he got, the harder it became to breathe. My heart was pounding so fast I thought I might pass out. As he neared my stop, the car slowed even more, creeping along like a predator closing in on its prey. I was frozen in place, bracing myself for the worst, when a loud humming sound broke through the wind. Another car appeared further up the street, its headlights piercing the curtain of snow. The native man slammed his foot on the gas pedal, his tires screeching against the icy road as he sped off into the storm. I watched as his car disappeared into the blizzard, leaving nothing behind but a trail of fear and unanswered questions. If that second car hadn't appeared at just that moment, I shudder to think what could have happened. One of my stopmates arrived a few seconds later, and the sight of her gave me the courage to finally move. I ran toward her, desperate for the safety of another person's presence. 2 years later, a 5-year-old's body was found in the nearby woods. The child had been abducted, and to this day, I can't shake the possibility that this story might be connected to mine. The thought of it sends chills down my spine. The idea that I might have been looking directly into the eyes of a killer. I called the cops not long after the incident and described what had happened in as much detail as I could. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but I never saw a police car in the neighborhood in the 5 years that followed. As for the photo he took, I'll never know if it was deleted, if it's hanging in some sick person's private collection, or if it's been uploaded to some twisted corner of the internet. But if you ever stumble upon a strange website and see a picture of a chubby little girl in a bright pink hat, her cheeks frostbitten and her face frozen in fear in the middle of a snowstorm, now you'll know the story behind it. When I was younger and had just started online college, I got my first apartment. I was juggling 3 jobs, including a 3rd-shift gig, but I was more than ready for independence. Life in the new apartment was great at first. However, I quickly ran into a problem. My new downstairs neighbor. The building had a small number of tenants, mostly older than me. One was an older man who had lived there for over 20 years. Another was an older woman with a young child who'd been there for a few years, and there was an empty apartment downstairs. I kept to myself and didn't interact with the other tenants much, but I noticed when a new person moved in. He was a man close to my age, maybe a little older, with greasy black hair and a slightly overweight build. Initially, I thought it might be nice to have someone around my age to say hello to, but that thought quickly soured. What started as a casual hello turned into uncomfortable remarks. The first red flag came when he commented, "That trash stinks," as I was taking out my garbage. I brushed it off, but the snide comments continued. He even made an inappropriate remark about my sister not wearing a bra when she came to visit me. Grossed out and annoyed, I reported his behavior to the landlord. Unsurprisingly, nothing came of it. Things escalated one day when I was asleep, and loud banging on my door jolted me awake. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the unexpected knock filled me with anxiety. Through the closed door, I heard him say I was being too loud and needed to stop harassing him. I explained, still behind the door, that I had been asleep and wasn't making any noise. He stomped away, muttering under his breath and calling me a bitch. My chest tightened as I tried to calm down and go back to bed. But a few minutes later, he was back, banging on the door again. When I addressed him, he repeated the same accusation, saying he was going to call the cops because I was still making noise. I told him to ask the other neighbor, since there was no way I could be making noise. I was on the other side of the building. He thanked me in an overly polite tone, then stomped off again, cursing me under his breath. I reported the incident to the landlord immediately, telling him I felt unsafe and uncomfortable. He said he would look into it. I didn't hear anything for a week. Later, I found out the real source of the noise, the old neighbor, who had been hitting the floor with a stick, like something out of a cartoon, to get the rude neighbor to turn down his loud music. The hostile neighbor should have known the noise wasn't coming from me, considering I lived on the opposite side of the building. It was as if he just wanted an excuse to confront me,
In the months that followed, his behavior only got worse.
One day, I went outside in a snowsuit, excited to play in the snow like a big kid at heart. As soon as he saw me, he made a rude comment about my outfit being unnecessary, despite the fact that there were 3 feet of snow on the ground. I don't remember exactly what I said back. Something like, "It's none of your business." He responded with a curt, "Fuck you." I walked away to enjoy the snow, but the interaction ruined the mood. I went back inside to get ready for work. The snowstorm worsened that night, and when I returned home from my night shift, I saw him sitting alone in his car in the parking lot. The engine was running, and the windows were rolled up. Something about the scene put me on high alert. I carefully walked around the car and up the alley to my apartment, relieved to close the door behind me. Not long after, I heard it. Loud, wall-shaking music. It was coming from his car. He was blasting his stereo at maximum volume in the middle of a snowstorm at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was confused and surprised, wondering what his reasoning could possibly be. Later, I found out the answer. He was doing it out of spite. His way of retaliating against the old neighbor for asking him to turn his music down. Things started to escalate quickly after that. The cursing in the hallways got worse, the music got louder, and the tension in the building reached a breaking point. Soon the police were knocking on our doors, asking about noise disturbances, and the neighbors collectively grew to hate the guy who was keeping everyone up at night. But that wasn't the worst of it. One night, I got back from my night shift around 3 a.m. Exhausted, I dragged myself to the mailboxes inside the townhouse door, flipping through ads and letters. That's when I heard it. The creak of his door opening at the top of the stairs. My stomach tightened. I silently prayed I wouldn't have to interact with him. Then he started speaking, or rather making strange, unintelligible sounds. His voice gurgled and mumbled something incoherent. "What?" I asked hesitantly, hoping he'd repeat himself clearly. Instead, he made the same noises, only louder and more aggressive. My instincts screamed that something was seriously wrong. Without saying another word, I turned around and headed straight back to my car. I thought I'd rather sleep in my car than risk dealing with whatever this is. But as I was having that thought, I heard a window above slam open. I froze, peering around the corner. I saw him leaning out the window, looking for me. He was yelling, speaking gibberish at the top of his lungs. I stood there for a moment, debating my next move, before deciding to sneak back inside and make a run for my apartment. I sped up the stairs as quietly as I could, passing his door and heading up to the second flight. Just as I reached the top, I heard his door swing open with a loud bang. The sound made me jump, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. He was muttering loudly, his nonsensical words growing more frantic, and then I heard his footsteps. He was following me. Panic surged as I scrambled for my keys, fumbling through my bag like I was in the middle of a horror movie. His footsteps grew louder as he climbed the last few steps. My hands shook as I finally found the right key and managed to slide it into the lock on the first try. I threw the door open, practically launched myself inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. He was right there, just 5 feet away, muttering gibberish and cursing me, calling me a bitch, before finally turning around and heading back down the stairs. Peeking through a crack in my window blinds, I watched as he paced back and forth outside the building, yelling and cursing at no one in particular. At one point, he screamed at the top of his lungs before wandering off into the night. Relieved that he was gone, for now, I headed to bed, hoping he wouldn't come back. The next day, I got a text from the landlord,
That guy was arrested and won't be coming back.
Attached to the text was a link. I raised an eyebrow at the landlord's comment. Now you tell me, and clicked on it. It led to a news article about the arrest, complete with his mugshot and a description of his behavior that night. It included details about stealing from a Turkey Hill, threatening police officers, punching one of them, and earlier in the evening, dropping his pants and rubbing himself against a window, then running around the town square yelling. I never saw him again after that. His family came to clear out his apartment, and that was the last trace of him in the building. Background. I immigrated to a small town, approximately 20,000 people, in the northeastern U.S. a little over a year ago from Australia. There aren't many people of my nationality here. We're pretty rare in this area. I also work a job that gives me a bit of a profile in the community, which is somewhat relevant to this story. For privacy, I've edited a few details, but here's what happened. A few weeks ago, while at work, I noticed a message in my Facebook Other inbox, the one where messages from people you're not friends with go. It was obviously from someone local, based on the limited info on his profile, so I figured it was just a random person who'd seen me around or recognized me from my job. That happens occasionally, so I wasn't overly concerned. The message read, "Hello, how are you? I have been to Australia 3 times for a total of 1.5 years. I lived in city and city. I went back in '93 and 2014. Please put in a friend request." I couldn't figure out how to do it from my end, as there was no option. Ed. Note. Yeah, you're part of the reason why there's no option. Hope to hear from you. Thanks, Phil. Later that evening, I was having dinner with my girlfriend, who owns a bar where I work on weekends. Mid-meal, she suddenly starts laughing and says, "Oh my God, I forgot to tell you this earlier. You're going to kill me." She launches into the story. "My first customer today comes in, and right away I can tell he's a bit off. He asks for a beer, so I give him one. And then he asks me what the age range of women who come here is. I tell him like 25 and up. He says, 'That's my age range, I'm 44. At this point, he's already rambling, but somehow the conversation shifts to Australia. He tells her he's been there a few times. My girlfriend, being the chatty type, says, "Oh, my boyfriend is that nationality." I cut her off mid-story, a sinking feeling in my stomach. "Wait, is his name Phil?" She bursts out laughing. "Yep." "Fuck me," I yell. Apparently, Phil spent a good hour at the bar showing off his knowledge of Australian slang and geography, as if trying to prove some kind of expertise. Then it got worse. He asked where I lived. Town," my girlfriend told him. "No, where exactly? Like what street?" he pressed. Then he wanted to know my full name and whether I worked at the bar. He proudly told her he loves people of my nationality and that he's a state-certified guide who could take me canoeing, hiking, or whatever. Right, because jumping into the woods with a strange guy who tracked me down on Facebook sounds like a great idea. 2 nights later, on a Friday, Phil showed up at the bar again. My girlfriend texted me saying he'd asked her whether he got my full name right because he'd sent me a Facebook message and hadn't gotten a response. He then went on to regale the bar with more Aussie lingo and told some off-color jokes, which offended at least one female patron. He announced that he'd be back the next night to see brutal_truth. A snowstorm that weekend spared me from the encounter, but the following weekend, I wasn't so lucky. As I was seating a couple of customers, Phil walked in. "Are you the nationality guy?" he asked loudly, zeroing in on me. Fuck. "Well, I'm one of them," I replied cautiously. Phil perched himself right on a bar stool in front of me, ordered a beer, and proceeded to talk at me nonstop. He rattled off every place he'd been in my country, random trivia facts. you know how much total area the continent consists of? And a long list of places he still wanted to visit. He wasn't just intense, he was completely oblivious to the fact that it was a busy Saturday night. I was the only bartender, running around the room trying to serve people, and he just kept talking. Thankfully, the woman sitting next to him, also not from around here, Colombian I think, got dragged into his orbit. He shifted his attention to her, talking about taking her out into the woods. Eventually, he asked for his check, then pointedly showed me the tip line and asked if it was enough. It wasn't, but at that point, I just wanted him gone. After he left, I was relieved, and my girlfriend, who had initially found his obsession with me funny, admitted that she was now seriously creeped out too.
I managed to avoid him for a couple of weeks until one Friday afternoon when my girlfriend and I were having a quick lunch at the pub before I headed to the office. We were sitting at a table near the bar when Phil, who had been mid-conversation with the bartender we know, turned around, strode over and said, "I've got something to show you, brutal_truth."
I tensed as he rummaged in the pocket of his jeans, then pulled out a handful of loose change, my country's currency.
Yeah, I've seen Australia's currency before, I said. Do you actually carry that around with you all the time? I love Australia, he replied, as though that explained everything. He launched into his shtick about wanting to visit city and city for the third time, completely failing to pick up on my half-turned away, ignoring him body language. Mercifully, the bartender came over to take our order, and Phil left to pay his tab. But not before handing the bartender a slip of paper with his contact information on it, in case anyone was interested in going out into the woods for outdoors activities. When the bartender brought it to our table, I couldn't help but shudder. The handwriting and layout of the note were unsettling, like something you'd find in a serial killer's personal effects. It made me genuinely question this guy's grip on reality. As Phil left, I let out an audible sigh of relief. My girlfriend and I started talking to the bartender about all our weird encounters with him, and of course, Phil returned. Quietly. He probably overheard everything because he'd forgotten his coat on the coat rack. Christ. Later that night, while I was at the office, he showed up at the bar again. This time, he told my girlfriend that he was a profession that involves being around children. Lovely. Then he asked, "Want to know the best day of my life?" She didn't respond, but he answered his own question anyway. He claimed that while in Australia in his 30s, he was invited to speak to an audience of students at an all-girls private school. Afterward, he said, he slept with one of the seniors. Somehow. I didn't ask for further details, and I'm grateful I wasn't there to hear it firsthand.
Thankfully, I haven't seen him since, but he cropped up again in what I hope is just a small-town coincidence. Last Friday, I shared this story with a coworker after she told me about being harassed by a weirdo she'd talked to on a dating website. Today, she told me, "I think the stalker outdoor guide who's following you around contacted me on a dating site." Sure enough, I looked at his profile. It was him. No question. She sent me screenshots of his About Me section, and they were the ramblings of a madman. I'd share them, but they'd probably give him away, and frankly, I don't want to deal with the fallout.